In today's gospel message, we hear words and phrases like fire on earth, households divided, and family members set apart against each other, division, hypocrites, and mankind's inability to understand what is actually happening in the present time. Wow. If there ever was a desperate cry, it's in our message today. Jesus in the gospel message is clearly calling us to action with a cry for urgency. There may be some who would interpret this passage as doom and gloom, but that's not the Christ that we know and love, is it? The fire that Jesus is talking about is God's all-powerful, healing, life-giving Spirit that washes us clean over and over and over again and makes us whole, and then stands us up, puts us on our feet, equipping us for the work of spreading the message of God's love to everyone we meet. Because we experienced it ourselves, not once, not twice, but time and time and time again in our own lives. And when God sends us into the world, empowered to bring the gospel message to everyone we meet, this call to action is not just for the disciples that were present when Jesus walked the earth, but rather for all of his disciples, and yes, even for us here in the 21st century. Jesus said to the crowds, "You can interpret the clouds and forecast the rain, so don't tell me you can't interpret the present times." I wonder how many times our Lord has said this to us in a manner of speaking. I can only speak for myself and can clearly say I've heard the whispers countless times in my life. Maybe being a disciple in the 21st century for you isn't about going on a mission trip to spread the gospel to countries far and wide. Or maybe it is. Maybe being a disciple is standing up for the injustices we experience here in our neighborhood, town, city, and for sure, our country. Maybe being a disciple is listening to the cries of God's people who are in need and responding in our own way as God's almighty, powerful Spirit leads our hearts into action. Maybe it means sitting with a person to listen when it's not easy or comfortable. Maybe being a disciple is lending a hand to a person in need and in bringing healing power of Christ to them by our love and action. When we look at the present state of affairs in our country, I can clearly see Jesus saying to us, like he did in the gospel message today, wake up. You can look at your cell phones and see the rainstorms coming, but what happened to your eyes? You can't interpret the current times where people are hurting, and you need to be about living the gospel message and spreading God's love. A call to action is what Jesus is giving us in our message of today. Action here and now in our everyday lives. In Hebrews, we hear the author describe the faith of God's people of old and reciting the stories of their journeys. Believe me, their lives and their political climate wasn't easy, and they trusted God to lead them to places that seemed impossible, which caused them and their families great risk, and sometimes their lives. These are who the author of Hebrews calls the great cloud of witnesses. Their faith, our faith, calls us to action. In today's gospel message, Jesus is calling us. Jesus is saying that if we have a relationship with him, we won't be able to sit still when we see injustices being done. We will be driven to act, and even when it's frightening. You know, how we are compelled to tell the story often in our lives, in one way or another, about God's healing, his love, and his courage, because we've experienced it. It means that we'll be looking for Christ in other people, and not only looking, but believing and expecting to find him. It means we will believe in God's mission and purpose for our lives and those we encounter. And yes, that means having superpowers. Many of you know that I grew up in upper state New York near the Canadian border, where it was almost always cold. And as I was finishing up high school, my parents let me know that they were not so keen on me continuing my education in college, but rather that I should use my hands and become an auto body mechanic. If you can imagine that. So having a desperate need to get away from that possibility, I, like many people of a young age, sought to leave home. So after a lot of praying, I decided to enter the Marine Corps. You know, anything that would get me away from that disaster waiting to happen. Needless to say, hammering out bumpers wasn't my vision for my future. After a lot of convincing, my parents relented and allowed me to join the military. You know that squeaky wheel gets greased sort of thing? I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to choose the area where I wanted to serve. So, of course, I chose to come closest home without being home. And that, for me, was New Jersey Naval Weapons Station Earle, which is located in Colts Neck on the Jersey Shore. My job was to provide security for the base. I had many nights alone in a shelter at an offset gate out in the woods. There I had plenty of time alone to talk with God. And in that old beat-up shelter is where I often pondered the next steps in my life, asking God impatiently what was next. One day, I encountered a woman who was a civilian employee of the base, who found it not hard to talk about her relationship with God, her church, and what wonders God was doing in her life. After many conversations with her, she invited me to church. It was an evangelical church. I felt welcomed, loved, and accepted. One Sunday I had a duty on base that I couldn't get out of. So I had to make my way to a new church. So I decided to attend the chapel on base. The service went along nicely, or so I thought, until the chaplain asked if anyone had anything good for the cause to say. So I proceeded to stand up and testify about Jesus and his love and the miracles he was doing in my life, which was pretty normal for my church. The service ended. Everyone was dismissed, and I went back to my quarters, not dreaming of what was to come next. The next day came, and I was told by my sergeant that I was required to report to the colonel of the base 0800 hours which is 8 a.m. in the morning. So in the morning, I reported to the colonel, having no clue what to expect, but to my surprise, the chaplain of the base had recommended that I be sent away for psychological evaluation because of my witness and testimony at the service. Talk about frightened. I don't think I've ever been so frightened in all my life. Within hours, my bags were packed and I climbed into the back of the van and we were whisked off to the psychiatric center for evaluation. And all because I professed Christ with exuberant joy and hope, believing that God could bring healing and wholeness, and not only to me, but to everyone. I was placed in a facility of about 20 men. Some of these men truly had psychological disorders. Some of them even believed that they were Jesus. Believe me, I was scared. I was alone. I felt lost and abandoned. One day turned into 2, and 2 days soon became 4, and before I knew it, a week had passed before I had the opportunity to be evaluated by the psychiatrist. In this place, men were being medicated. It really was horrible. People didn't have the opportunity to be themselves while medicated. These drugs were heavy. Maybe some of the men were drugged for a good reason, but I got to know a few of them. And they weren't trouble, and their beliefs weren't that far off, and they weren't going to be harmful to other people either. The word scary doesn't accurately define how I felt. When anyone couldn't sleep, medication was pushed. And it was a common practice for anyone who wasn't falling in line to be considered a troubled person and medicated. I refused medication of any kind, thankfully. I narrowly escaped. Over time, I made friends with some of the staff, and often late at night, I would go to the TV area and sit with a few attendees who were kind. One of the workers showed an interest in conversation with me and started questioning what about my faith. He was interested to hear my story. I can remember how frightened I was even to talk about my faith. Frightened beyond belief. After a few times sitting and sharing about Christ and God's love in my life, I started to see a change in him. This man, by God's miracle and love, had what we, as Episcopalians, call an epiphany. God spoke to him deep inside and changed him that day. This attendee started to seek out and to go and discuss God and God's love. Clearly, he had an experience. He met Jesus. He was changed. He told me how he found a local church. You see, he had lost someone in his life. He was depressed. And he was giving up hope. And by God's grace, he found hope again. So maybe, just maybe, God had a purpose for all of this. Maybe God used the circumstance I was in for me to encounter someone who I never would have encountered, someone who was lost, who needed to be healed and made whole. Within days after this experience, I met the psychiatrist, and after about an hour of discussions, he said, all of what you explain about your beliefs in your church and your expression of your faith isn't abnormal. And I see no reason why they even asked for this evaluation. She proceeded to apologize for having me wait. She explained she was away on a conference, and this was her first opportunity to meet with me, assuring me that she would release me immediately, and within a few days, I'd be transported back to my base to resume my post. I know this is not the average example of what we might go through, but this is just one example of how God can take a frightening, unimaginable experience and bring about wholeness, healing, and life. And all of what is waiting for us as we live into our faith. Because He loved us first. The fire that Jesus talked about in the gospel today is God's all-powerful healing, life-giving Spirit that washes us clean over and over and over again and makes us whole and puts us on our feet, equipping us for the work of spreading the message of God's love to everyone we meet, because we've experienced it ourselves, not once, not twice, but time and time and time again in our own lives, daily, hourly, and always. And then God sends us in faith, in action into the world, empowering us to bring the gospel message to everyone we meet. Yep, superheroes. Listen, can you hear it? God said, you're my disciples of the 21st century. Embrace it, have faith, and act. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.